Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. In the late Houston twilight, it stood as a monument to a new kind of capitalism. A gleaming 50-story blue glass obelisk that pierced the Texas sky. The Enron building. From the outside, it was a cathedral of modern commerce, a symbol of unassailable success. Inside, it was something else entirely. It was a laboratory, an arena, a casino. It was the nerve center of a company that had transcended the grubby business of pipelines and power plants to become an idea. The idea that the brightest minds, armed with radical new theories and boundless ambition, could reshape the very fabric of the economy. They called themselves the smartest guys in the room, and for a while, the world believed them. The company was a Wall Street darling, lauded by Fortune magazine as America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years. Its stock price soared, seemingly defying gravity, creating a generation of paper millionaires among its employees. They weren't just trading gas and electricity anymore. They were creating markets out of thin air for everything from broadband internet capacity to weather derivatives. They were pioneers, cowboys of the new millennium, and their chairman, Ken Lay, a folksy preacher's son with a doctorate in economics, was their benevolent patriarch. He spoke of changing the world, of bringing the frictionless efficiency of the market to every corner of human enterprise. And under him served his brilliant, aggressive CEO, Jeff Skilling, a man who saw the world not in terms of people or products, but as a portfolio of assets to be traded, hedged, and leveraged. But beneath the polished surface, below the soaring stock charts and glowing press releases, a rot was taking hold. A complex and deliberate deception was being woven into the very DNA of the corporation. It was a fraud so vast, so audacious, that it required a new language to describe it, a lexicon of special-purpose entities, phantom profits, and aggressive accounting that baffled even seasoned analysts. This was not a simple case of skimming from the till. This was the wholesale fabrication of a reality, a multi-billion-dollar illusion held together by sheer force of will, intellectual arrogance, and a culture that rewarded recklessness above all else. When the illusion finally shattered, it wouldn't just be a company that collapsed. It would be a supernova, wiping out 20,000 jobs, vaporizing over $70 billion in market value, and destroying the life savings of countless employees who had staked their futures on the integrity of their leaders. Today on Anatomy of Crime, we are not dissecting a murder of the flesh, but a murder of trust. We are performing an autopsy on a corporation. We will peel back the layers of impenetrable jargon and convoluted balance sheets to expose the fatal pathology at its core. This is the story of a crime that required no weapons, no getaway cars, just a series of signatures on a balance sheet. Today, we dissect the anatomy of corporate deceit. The story of Enron begins, as many American epics do, with deregulation. In the 1980s, the United States government began to unchain the natural gas industry from decades of rigid federal control. Before, prices were fixed, and pipelines operated as simple utilities, charging a set fee to transport gas from point A to point B. It was a stable, predictable, and frankly boring business. But a man named Kenneth Lay saw something else. He saw an opportunity not just to transport gas, but to trade it like a commodity, like pork bellies or gold. He envisioned a gas bank, an intermediary that could connect buyers and sellers, hedge against price fluctuations, and create a dynamic liquid market where none had existed before. In 1985, Lay's company, Houston Natural Gas, merged with a competitor, Internorth of Omaha, to create a new entity with a sprawling network of interstate pipelines. They named it Enron. In its early days, Enron was still a traditional asset-heavy company. It owned things you could touch, thousands of miles of steel pipe buried in the ground. But Ken Lay's vision was far more abstract. He wasn't interested in the nuts and bolts of the energy business. He was interested in the theory. He was a true believer in the power of the free market, an evangelist for a new kind of asset-light corporation that derived its value not from what it owned, but from what it knew and what it could trade. To realize this vision, he needed a new kind of executive, someone who wasn't a traditional oil and gas man. In 1990, he found him. Jeffrey Skilling was a brilliant, pugnacious consultant from McKinsey & Company. He was a Harvard Business School graduate who viewed the world with a cold Darwinian logic. Skilling didn't just embrace Lay's idea of a gas bank. He supercharged it. He argued that Enron shouldn't just be a broker. It should be the market. He proposed a radical model where Enron would use its vast resources to create complex, long-term contracts, guaranteeing prices for producers and consumers years into the future. It was a revolutionary concept, but it came with a problem. The problem was traditional accounting. Under the old rules, a company like Enron could only recognize revenue from a long-term contract as the money actually came in year by year. This was too slow for Skilling's ambition. It didn't reflect the supposed genius of the deals being made today. He wanted to be able to book the entire estimated future profit of a 20-year contract the very moment the deal was signed. To do this, Enron needed permission from the Securities and Exchange Commission to use a controversial accounting method known as mark-to-market. In 1992, with the help of powerful lobbying and the blessing of their accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, they got it. And with that single decision, the first seed of Enron's destruction was planted. Mark-to-market accounting is not inherently fraudulent. It's a standard practice in securities trading, where the value of a stock or a bond can be easily determined by its current market price. You simply mark its value to the market at the end of each day. But Enron applied this principle to something far murkier, the estimated future value of complex, long-term energy contracts for which no real market existed. Enron itself was essentially guessing what the price of gas would be 10, 15, even 20 years down the line. It allowed them to book massive, hypothetical profits based on their own internal projections. Imagine you're a home builder. Under traditional accounting, if you sign a contract to build a house for $100,000, you recognize that income as you complete the work and receive payments. Under Enron's version of mark-to-market, you could claim the entire projected profit, say $20,000, on the day you signed the contract. Before a single nail was hammered, it created an immense, almost irresistible pressure to do deals. Any deal. The bigger and longer the contract, the bigger the immediate paper profit that could be booked. The actual long-term quality of the deal became secondary. What mattered was the pop, the immediate boost to the bottom line that would drive up Enron's stock price and trigger huge bonuses for the executives who made the deals. This system was Jeff Skilling's brainchild, and it transformed the company's culture. He instituted a notoriously brutal performance review system known as the Performance Review Committee, or PRC. Employees called it rank and yank. Each year, every employee was graded on a scale of 1 to 5. Those in the bottom 10 to 15%, the 5s, were summarily fired. It didn't matter if you'd had a stellar record for years. One bad year, and you were out. This created a culture of intense, cutthroat internal competition. It fostered a desperate, short-term mentality where employees would do anything to make their numbers look good for the next review cycle. It discouraged cooperation, and most dangerously, it punished anyone who raised questions or delivered bad news. In the world Skilling built, you either fed the beast of earnings growth or you were fed to it. The company began to attract a certain type of person, young, brilliant, and breathtakingly arrogant. They were traders, quants, and MBA graduates who saw themselves as masters of the universe. They reveled in risk, worshipped complexity, and viewed regulation with contempt. The trading floor at Enron was legendary, a testosterone-fueled pit where billions of dollars were gambled on the flicker of a price on a screen. The deals became ever more esoteric. They moved beyond natural gas to electricity, then to things that barely seemed real, like broadband capacity and weather futures. With each new market they created, they could book more and more mark-to-market profits, dazzling Wall Street analysts who, for the most part, had no idea how the company was actually making its money. They just saw the numbers go up quarter after quarter, and that was enough. But there was a dark side to the mark-to-market model. What happens if your projections are wrong? What happens if a deal goes sour? Under the same accounting rules, you're supposed to book those losses. But booking losses was anathema at Enron. It would stop the relentless upward march of the stock price, the very engine of the company's perceived success and the source of its executives' wealth. The company was becoming a shark. It had to keep moving forward, keep booking ever larger profits, or it would die. They needed a way to make the bad deals, the mountains of debt they were accumulating to finance their global expansion, simply disappear. They needed a magician, and they found one in a young, ambitious executive named Andy Fastow. Andrew Fastow joined Enron in 1990 and quickly rose through the ranks to become chief financial officer in 1998. He wasn't a trader or a deal maker in the classic Enron mold. He was a finance guy, a specialist in structuring complex financial deals. While Skilling was the architect of Enron's grand vision, Fastow became the plumber, the man who worked in the basement, building the elaborate network of pipes that would carry away the company's toxic waste. His primary tool was an obscure financial vehicle known as the Special Purpose Entity, or SPE. An SPE is a legal entity, a partnership or a company, created to fulfill a specific, narrow objective. In legitimate business, they're often used to isolate financial risk. For example, a company might create an SPE to finance a large construction project, so that if the project fails, it doesn't bankrupt the entire parent company. But in the hands of Andy Fastow, the SPE became an instrument of mass deception. He used them to create a shadow financial system, a second set of books where Enron could hide its colossal debt and dump its underperforming assets. The mechanics were deliberately bewildering, but the basic principle was simple. Enron would sell one of its bad assets, a failing power plant in Brazil, for example, to one of Fastow's specs. The SPE would pay for the asset, often with money borrowed from a bank, but guaranteed by Enron's stock. This transaction allowed Enron to do two miraculous things. First, it removed the poorly performing asset and its associated debt from its own balance sheet, making Enron appear healthier and less indebted than it really was. Second, Because it was a sale, Enron could often book an immediate profit from the transaction, even if the asset was a complete dog. It was an accounting magic trick. Enron was essentially moving its own garbage from the living room into a closet, and then paying itself for the effort. Fasto created a dizzying array of these specs with bizarre, almost whimsical names. There was Chuko, named after the Star Wars character Chewbacca. There were Jedi, LJM, and the Raptors. The most notorious of these was LJM, named from the first initials of Fasto's wife and 2 children. And here is where the scheme crossed the line from aggressive accounting into outright, jaw-dropping fraud. Not only was Fasto, as Enron's CFO, advising his own company to do deals with these outside entities, he was also the one running them. He was sitting on both sides of the table. He personally invested in and managed LJM, which did almost all of its business with Enron. This created an astronomical conflict of interest. Enron's board, incredibly, signed off on this arrangement, allowing their own CFO to personally profit from the very entities designed to manipulate Enron's financial statements. And profit he did. Fasto made over $45 million from his management of the LJM partnerships. He was effectively using his position inside Enron to enrich himself, negotiating deals on behalf of the company with partnerships that he himself controlled. He was extracting wealth from the very company he was supposed to be serving. The Raptor specs were perhaps his most audacious creation. These entities were set up to hedge Enron's own high-flying tech stock investments. When the dot-com bubble began to burst in 2000, the value of Enron's portfolio plummeted. To avoid booking billions in losses, Fasto transferred these stocks to the Raptors. The Raptors then gave Enron a promissory note, essentially an IOU, for the original value of the stocks. But the Raptors had no real assets of their own. They were capitalized almost entirely with Enron's own stock. It was a complete house of mirrors. Enron was promising to pay itself for its own losses with its own inflated stock. As long as Enron's stock price kept going up, the illusion could be maintained. But if the stock ever started to fall, the entire fragile structure would collapse, and the hidden losses would come roaring back onto Enron's books. It was a doomsday machine, and Andy Fasto had just armed the timer. By the year 2000, Enron was at the absolute zenith of its power and arrogance. The company's stock hit a high of over $90 a share, and its reported revenues were over $100 billion. To the outside world, it was an unstoppable force of nature. And nowhere was this terrifying power more evident than in the state of California. In 2000 and 2001, California was plunged into a severe energy crisis. A botched deregulation of its electricity market had created the perfect storm, and Enron's traders, with their predatory instincts and market-dominating position, were the sharks that circled. The crisis manifested as a series of rolling blackouts that crippled the state, shutting down businesses, snarling traffic, and leaving millions in the dark. Electricity prices skyrocketed, soaring to more than 50 times their normal rate, bankrupting the state's largest utility companies and costing the state of California an estimated $40 to $45 billion. While Californians suffered, Enron's traders in Houston and Portland celebrated. They had found the ultimate market to exploit. Internal documents and audio recordings that emerged later revealed the shocking cynicism with which Enron manipulated the California market. Traders developed a playbook of strategies with names that sounded like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon. Fat Boy, Get Shorty, Death Star. These schemes were designed to create artificial shortages and game the system. For instance, traders would schedule massive amounts of energy transmission on California's power lines that they had no intention of actually delivering, a practice known as phantom congestion. This created the false appearance of a grid shortage, allowing Enron to charge exorbitant prices for the electricity it did deliver. In another scheme, they would export power out of the state when prices were low, and then, as the manufactured shortage drove prices up, they would sell that same power back into California at a massive premium. The audio recordings are chilling. They capture traders, laughing about gouging Grandma Millie, and joking about the wildfires raging in the state. One trader is heard saying, "He's fucking taking all the money from those poor grandmothers in California." Yeah, Grandma Millie, man. But she's the one who couldn't figure out how to fucking vote on the butterfly ballot. The contempt was palpable. To them, California wasn't a state full of people. It was a game, a massive ATM to be plundered for the benefit of Enron's bottom line. This episode perfectly encapsulated the Enron culture. The real world had ceased to matter. The consequences of their actions on ordinary people were an abstraction. A joke. All that mattered was the trade, the profit, the number on the screen. Jeff Skilling, when questioned about the crisis, infamously dismissed the state's problems, remarking with characteristic callousness, "You know the difference between the state of California and the Titanic. At least when the Titanic went down, the lights were on. The California energy crisis generated billions in revenue for Enron, providing the cash flow needed to prop up the failing international assets and keep the mark-to-market and SPE scams afloat a little while longer. It was the company's last great predatory act, a final spectacular feast before the sickness festering within finally consumed it." The illusion, however, was becoming harder and harder to maintain. By early 2001, the dot-com bubble had burst, and the markets were growing skeptical of companies with complex, opaque business models. Enron's stock, once seemingly invincible, began to slide. This was more than just a problem. It was an existential threat. The entire house of cards Fasto had built, the Raptors, the Spes, was propped up by the value of Enron's stock. As the price fell, the doomsday machine began to tick louder. The hidden losses were threatening to break free. Cracks began to appear from the inside as well. A growing number of executives were becoming deeply uncomfortable with Fasto's partnerships. The conflicts of interest were too blatant, the accounting too aggressive. But the culture of rank and yank and the sheer force of Skilling's personality silenced most dissent. To question the model was to be branded as stupid, as not being a team player. It was career suicide. Still, the pressure was mounting. Behind the scenes, the company was hemorrhaging cash. The grand ventures, from the broadband trading market to a massive power plant in India, were all spectacular failures, losing billions of dollars. But on paper, thanks to the magic of mark-to-market and the Spes, Enron was still reporting record profits. Then, on August 14, 2001, came the shockwave. Jeff Skilling, the architect, the high priest of Enron's ideology, abruptly resigned as CEO, citing personal reasons. He had been in the top job for only 6 months. It was a stunning announcement that baffled Wall Street. Why would the captain abandon his ship when it was, by all public accounts, sailing so smoothly? In retrospect, the answer is clear. Skilling, the smartest guy in the room, knew the ship was taking on water fast. He saw the iceberg ahead and decided to take the last lifeboat. He later claimed he had no idea the company was in such dire straits, a claim that would be torn apart in court. His departure signaled to the few who were paying close attention that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Just a week after Skilling's resignation, A different kind of signal emerged from within the company's ranks. Sharon Watkins, a vice president in Andy Fasto's finance division, had been reviewing the books for some of the spec. With her background as an accountant for Arthur Andersen, she was one of the few people who could actually understand the labyrinthine structures Fasto had created, and what she saw horrified her. She recognized that the company's entire financial foundation was a sham, propped up by these off-balance sheet vehicles and faulty accounting. On August 22, she wrote a now famous, anonymous, one-page memo to Ken Lay, who had resumed the CEO role after Skilling's departure. She didn't pull any punches. "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals," she wrote. She described the partnerships in stark detail. Calling the accounting aggressive and improper, she stated plainly that Enron had created a situation that could bring the company down. "I have heard one senior-level employee say, 'I know it would be devastating to all of us, but I wish we would get caught. We're such a crooked company.' It was a desperate plea from the engine room, a warning that the ship was about to go under." Ken Lay met with Watkins. He listened to her concerns, told her he would take them seriously, and promised an investigation. But he didn't call the SEC. He didn't bring in independent auditors. He turned the investigation over to the very people who had approved the deals in the first place. Enron's own law firm, Vinson and Elkins, and their auditors, Arthur Andersen. It was the equivalent of asking the Foxes to investigate the disappearance of chickens from the henhouse. Unsurprisingly, their report concluded that while the accounting was certainly aggressive, and the public disclosures could have been better, nothing was fundamentally wrong. They recommended no major changes. Lay, armed with this report, reassured his employees and the market that all was well. The final chance to steer the company away from the iceberg had been ignored. The ship was now listing badly, and the outside world was beginning to notice. Journalists, particularly Bethany McLean at Fortune and Rebecca Smith and John Emshwiller at the Wall Street Journal, began publishing articles that asked the simple, devastating question, how does Enron make its money? They pointed to the company's opaque financial statements and the massive gap between its reported profits and its actual cash flow. The questions, once whispered, were now being shouted. The dam broke on October 16, 2001. Enron announced its third-quarter results, and they were catastrophic. The company reported a loss of $638 million. Even more stunningly, it announced a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity, much of it related to unwinding some of Andy Fasto's convoluted partnerships. It was the first public admission that the magic wasn't real. The hidden losses were starting to surface. The market reacted with brutal speed. The stock price, which had been hovering in the 30s, began a death spiral. The announcement triggered a formal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, the company was under a microscope. A few days later, Enron made another shocking disclosure. The company had been overstating its profits by nearly $600 million over the previous 4 years. The numbers that Wall Street had trusted, the numbers upon which billions of dollars in investments had been made, were a lie. Andy Fasto was fired. The panic was now in full swing. The credit rating agencies, which had been inexplicably slow to react, finally downgraded Enron's debt to just above junk status. This was the fatal blow. Much of Enron's trading business relied on maintaining an investment-grade credit rating. Without it, partners would demand cash up front for deals, and Enron was a company with phantom profits but very little actual cash. The company was in a liquidity crisis. A frantic, last-ditch attempt to sell the company to a smaller rival, Dynegy, fell apart when the true state of Enron's books became clear. The doomsday machine had detonated, the Raptors and the other spec collapsed, and the billions in hidden debt came flooding back onto Enron's balance sheet. The company's finances were revealed to be a black hole. On December 2, 2001, Enron, the seventh largest corporation in the United States, a company with $63 billion in stated assets, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was, at the time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. The news was a seismic shock to the financial world, but for Enron's 20,000 employees, it was a personal apocalypse. In the preceding months, as the stock price cratered, top executives had cashed out hundreds of millions of dollars in stock options. Ken Lay himself sold over $70 million worth of shares while publicly encouraging his employees to buy more, calling the falling stock price a great opportunity. But ordinary employees were locked out of selling their own shares in their 401k retirement plans during a crucial administrative changeover. They were forced to watch helplessly as their life savings, which they had been heavily encouraged to invest in Enron stock, evaporated into nothing. The average employee 401k lost 99% of its value. Lives were ruined. Futures were erased. The smartest guys in the room had picked the pockets of their own people on their way out the door. The collapse of Enron was more than just a corporate failure. It was a crime scene, and now the investigators descended. What they uncovered was a culture of deception that was even more pervasive than imagined. In the weeks leading up to the bankruptcy, a massive systematic effort to destroy evidence had taken place. At Enron's headquarters, shredding machines worked overtime. But the most infamous act of obstruction occurred at Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen, once one of the Big Five global accounting firms, a symbol of probity and trust. Arthur Andersen was deeply complicit in Enron's fraud. They had signed off on the aggressive accounting, blessed Fasto's conflicted partnerships, and given Enron a clean bill of health year after year, all while collecting over $1 million a week in fees. As the SEC investigation loomed, Andersen partners in the Houston office ordered the wholesale destruction of documents related to Enron. Tons of paper were shredded. Thousands of emails and computer files were deleted. It was a blatant attempt to cover their tracks. But it backfired spectacularly. In March 2002, the U.S. Justice Department indicted the entire firm of Arthur Andersen for obstruction of justice. The trial was swift, and the conviction came in June. For a professional services firm whose only real asset is its reputation, the verdict was a death sentence. The 85,000-person firm, which had been in business for nearly 90 years, effectively ceased to exist. It was a stunning demonstration of how deep the rot went. The government's main effort was led by a specially created Enron task force. Their goal was to go after the individuals at the top. The first major domino to fall was Andy Fasto. In October 2002, he was indicted on 78 counts, including fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Fasto eventually struck a deal. In January 2004, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy and agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution, becoming their star witness against his former bosses, Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling. His wife, Lee Fasto, also pleaded guilty to a tax charge for her role in the schemes and served a year in prison. The main event, the trial of Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, began in January 2006. It was one of the most anticipated white-collar crime trials in American history. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of former Enron executives, including Fasto, who laid out the details of the conspiracy. They portrayed Lay as the distant, hands-off preacher who set the tone of corruption, and Skilling as the brilliant hands-on architect of the fraud, a man obsessed with the stock price above all else. The defense strategy was to portray both men as victims, tragically unaware of the fraud being perpetrated below them by a rogue CFO, Andy Fasto. They argued there was no overarching conspiracy, just the criminal acts of one man. They painted Fasto as a liar and a thief who was now trying to save his own skin by turning on his innocent bosses. Skilling, in particular, came across on the stand as arrogant and combative, seemingly unable to comprehend that anyone could question his genius or his methods. Lay adopted a more grandfatherly persona, claiming he was betrayed and misled. The jury didn't buy it. On May 25, 2006, after 6 days of deliberation, they delivered their verdict. Jeffrey Skilling was found guilty on 19 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and insider trading. Kenneth Lay was found guilty on all 6 counts he faced. It was a moment of profound catharsis. The men at the very top, who had presided over the destruction of so many lives, and had walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars, were finally being held to account. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the Enron saga had one final bizarre twist. On July 5, 2006, less than 4 months before he was due to be sentenced, Ken Lay died of a massive heart attack while on vacation in Colorado. Because he died before he could appeal his conviction, the court, under a legal principle known as abatement, was forced to vacate his conviction entirely. In the eyes of the law, it was as if Kenneth Lay had never been tried. He died, legally, an innocent man. Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced in October 2006 to 24 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for a white-collar crime. He was also ordered to pay $45 million in restitution. Andy Fasto, for his extensive cooperation, received a much lighter sentence of 6 years. He was released from prison in 2011. Skilling's sentence was later reduced, and he was released from federal custody in February of 2019 after serving 12 years. Many other lower-level executives also served prison time. The legal fallout was immense, but for the thousands of former employees who lost everything, it was cold comfort. The ultimate outcome of the Enron case was a landscape forever changed. The scandal directly led to the passage of one of the most significant pieces of corporate reform legislation in American history, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. This law imposed strict new rules on corporate governance, accountability, and financial reporting. It created new requirements for auditors, new responsibilities for corporate boards, and new criminal penalties for executives who knowingly certify false financial statements. It was a direct attempt to legislate against the kind of behavior that had flourished in the moral vacuum of Enron's executive suite. The question of its long-term effectiveness is still debated, but its passage marked the end of an era of corporate impunity. In dissecting the anatomy of this crime, we find that Enron was not the result of a single flaw, but a systemic and catastrophic failure of multiple organs at once. It began with the intellectual disease of mark-to-market accounting, a theory that allowed the company to divorce its profits from the reality of cash. This was compounded by the structural cancer of the special-purpose entities, a system designed by Andy Fasto to metastasize debt and hide losses throughout a shadow financial system. The entire organism was animated by a toxic corporate culture, Skilling's rank and yank, that created a hyper-Darwinian environment where ethical concerns were seen as a sign of weakness. And finally, the body's immune system failed. The external auditors at Arthur Andersen, the financial analysts on Wall Street, the credit rating agencies, and even Enron's own board of directors, all the watchdogs that were supposed to protect the integrity of the system, were either asleep, incompetent, or willfully complicit, seduced by the massive fees and the illusion of perpetual growth. Enron wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a rotten orchard. The crime was not just what Lay, Skilling, and Fastow did. It was what an entire ecosystem of enablers allowed them to do. The legacy of Enron is a cautionary tale written in the language of bankruptcy filings and ruined lives. It stands as a permanent monument to the destructive power of unchecked hubris. It reminds us that complexity is often a cloak for deception, and that innovation without integrity is simply a more efficient way to collapse. It exposed the terrifying truth that some of the largest, most destructive crimes are not committed at the point of a gun, but with the stroke of a pen in a corporate boardroom. And the final, chilling lesson from the fall of this paper empire is how fragile the line is between the smartest guys in the room and the architects of their own ruin. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.